Only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on stormwater sampling. My name's James and I'll be your moderator for today's event. So before we get started and dive into the presentation today, I just wanted to give you some information on what this webinar is going to entail and provide some housekeeping items as well. We'll start with a slideshow presentation addressing the various phases and aspects of stormwater sampling and how to go about planning and executing your next project. Our speaker will focus pretty heavily on the preparation stage and will provide some tips to help overcome the challenges associated with weather forecasts, lab requirements, safety, and things like that. Following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions pretty much any time by typing them into the questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note, as stated on the slide here, that everyone's microphones will be turned off for the entirety of the webinar. But if you do have a question or a technical issue comes up, you can use that questions box to communicate, and I'll address that for you. Please keep in mind you will receive a copy of the slide deck and the recording of today's webinar. You should receive all of that by the end of the day today, if not tomorrow. So any materials presented will be in your inbox by tomorrow. Today's speaker, Daryl Intress, is Wastewater Services Manager for Triumvirate Environmental's operations in the New England region and provides support elsewhere throughout Triumvirate's service area along the East Coast. Daryl joined the Triumvirate team in 2011 and has led the wastewater department's field technicians, project managers, and engineers to deliver their safety services responsibly and at a high value. He has over 10 years of experience in the environmental services industry, including technical, engineering, and management. So with that, I'll turn things over to Daryl. Hey, Daryl.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everybody. So to start off here, just give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect. So we're kind of geared this discussion towards project managers and field staff, but certainly anyone that manages stormwater compliance. I believe you'll get some benefit out of this. And again, as James mentioned, with the focus on planning, managing, and executing sampling. We'll also provide some key tools for a successful project. And you may ask, how do I determine what requirements I have? Well, that could be another webinar all in of itself, but again, the focus here is about planning and implementing a sampling project, but we can certainly help out if you have any questions after this webinar about how to determine what sampling requirements you do have and getting to that point. So to kind of kick off, we have a poll question. I think James is going to put that up for everybody to respond. The question here, how often do you review or update your SWIP or Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan and Sampling Plan? I'll give you a little bit of time, 2 seconds here to talk in your answers. James, let me know how that's looking.
Sure, we'll give it another 10 seconds or so and close that out.
We got choices here for a range of periods of time that you may or may not, in the case maybe, review your plan.
So Daryl, looks pretty good. About 61% are reviewing their plans annually, another 17% once every couple of years, 17% never, and about 6% more than once a year.
Okay, sounds like a kind of a range there, but a pretty good. Most people have a handle on. Yeah, certainly recommended would be every year or more frequently. So I think the majority were in that category. And maybe the folks that have never done it, maybe you're new to that program, or just you're kind of in the learning stages and understanding what the requirements are. So hopefully we can help you with that. The agenda for today is the major subject headings. We'll give you a little bit of an introduction as to why we sample stormwater, get into sampling project preparation and planning, and again, that's the main kind of crux of what we'll be talking about today. Talk about some sampling techniques and equipment, managing samples and the results, and give a little summary and Q&A session at the end. So why would we sample stormwater in the first place? Well, the basic answer may be the EPA or the state under the multi-sector general permit says you have to. So that's I guess as good as the reason as any if the law tells you you have to do that. The MSGP or multi-sector general permit, as I mentioned, is part of the NIPDES or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program. and that addresses water pollution by regulating point sources. So most people are familiar with the Clean Water Act in 1972. The Northeast Permanent Program came out of that, and it was authorized to state governments to perform any aspects of the program on behalf of the EPA. So that would be for delegated states, which is the vast majority of the United States. There are 4 states, Idaho, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Mexico, as well as the District of Columbia, all U.S. territories except the Virgin Islands and some other territories as well, that the EPA is still manages those programs in those areas, and the non-delegated state, as those would be referred to. And industrial stormwater has been regulated since the first EPA stormwater regulations in 1990, and the first multi-sector general permit for industrial stormwater discharges was issued in 1995, reissued in 2000 and 2008, and again most recently in 2015. The regulatory citation here for 40 CFR 122 is where industrial categories are identified that are subject to stormwater regulations either by SIC code or by a general description of the industrial activities at that site. And here's that list of the general industrial descriptions. So if not by SIC code, these are some categories that are regulated under for stormwater exposure and discharge. So yeah, it's a quick background on the program and how it exists, but then here we get into the main meat of our discussion today for sampling, project preparation, and planning. So the basics, as far as the latest and greatest 2015 MSGP goes, the notice of intent must be submitted, and that's even including previously covered sites under the 2008 MSGP. That permit, the 2008 MSGP, expired in 2013, but it was administratively continued until the new 2015 MSGP was issued for this year. So if you had a 2008 coverage for your facility, then it would continue until the new MSGP was issued. So the NOI was due for any previously covered facilities or any discharges that started before the 2015 MSGP was issued. That NOI is due on September 2nd of this year. So if you're a little behind on that, that's something that you want to get up to speed on, especially if you've had continuing discharge. For any discharges that commenced after September 2nd, 2015, so since the NOI was due for the previously covered and existing discharges, there's a minimum of 30 days prior to the start of discharge to get that NOI submitted. And it's an electronic notice of intent process that makes it a lot quicker and sure that it's going to be submitted into the EPA system through the online system. And going back to the topic of our poll question, as far as reviewing your stormwater prevention plan goes, you want to make sure you update it with any new SWIP team members or any changes to the SWIP team, any erosion controls, any site improvements that have happened. So again, another reason to do that on an annual basis, and confirming any existing and new monitoring or sampling requirements. Kind of use the word monitoring and sampling interchangeably here. So if you're under the new permit, there may be some changes. There haven't been very many changes, but there still could be some changes specific for your facility. And also communicate with the sampling teams, contractors, and laboratories. So what type of monitoring are you required to do? Well, there's 3 main categories of types of monitoring or sampling that you'd be required to do under the MSGP. The first and most basic here is visual assessments. So we're looking at visual indicators of pollution such as color, odor, clarity, floating solids, settled solids, foam, and oil sheen. And what you do is collect samples and make visual observations in accordance with your SWIP. So again, reviewing your SWIP and making sure your SWIP is specific to your facility, using those observations to identify how effective your control measures are, and use those findings, those observations, and qualitative findings for guiding further inspections and adding corrective actions for any problems that you may find. indicator or benchmark monitoring or sampling includes the visual, everything that's covered in the visual assessments, but you're going to add that you're going to submit samples to a laboratory for analysis. You'll actually get quantitative results. You're going to compare those results to the benchmark concentrations that help indicate how well your stormwater control measures are performing. So it's a quantitative comparison as opposed to a qualitative with just the visual. But there's no violations as a result of exceeding a benchmark standard. But you want to consider those as red flags for potential problems that you'll want to address. And compliance sampling, again, all of the above, so the same as visual assessments, and with indicator and benchmark monitoring, you're going to be collecting samples and sending them to a laboratory. But where compliance is concerned, this is when a federal effluent limitation guideline, or ELG, applies to the limits on the stormwater runoff. And sampling determines the compliance of those limits, or with those limits, rather. So you'll compare your analytical results to those limits, and if you have anything that's over those limits, then that would be a violation. And you're reporting to the EPA or the state, usually through their net DMR system or something similar. So the net DMR system is the EPA system, and many states have a comparable or copycat version of that. Now, as far as the site itself goes and preparing there, you want to know where to collect the samples. So you make sure that you've got all those discharge locations marked down on your site map. You've identified them. Drainage structures, anywhere where stormwater is leaving your facility. So where you may have sheet flow off of a parking lot, for example, it's hard to get a sample of a wide swath of water flowing off of a paved surface. So you want to have swales or some way to concentrate that, gutters, so you can more easily collect the stormwater samples into the containers. And any soil areas, you want to make sure those are covered with an impermeable material to avoid contaminating your sample. You want to make sure the samples are representative. That's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But if your stormwater is coming off of a paved surface and then right before the discharge is going over a soil surface, you're going to want to make sure that that soil surface is covered with an impermeable material so you're not contaminating with soil that's not really representative of that stormwater. Now, selecting a laboratory that you're going to, selecting a laboratory that you're going to submit your samples to. A few guidelines here, good practices and some requirements. Good idea to use a laboratory that participates in the DMR QA program, and what that stands for is the Discharge Monitoring Report Quality Assurance Program. That's run by the EPA and participating states. And it's a single blind test or study where the laboratory is with a deemed to be an unknown sample to be analyzed by a certain method, and then they report those results, and they have to report the results in a certain range. And then if they're inside that range, they pass. If not, there's some corrective actions to take to make sure they're in compliance with that QA program. I'm going to make sure the laboratory is NELAP approved, and that's a national certification program. And communicate in advance with the laboratory so they're aware that you're going to be using that. You want to get your pricing set up, understand what requirements they have, and we'll get into that more, as well as additional services that they may offer. Convenience services, especially such as pre-printing labels, chains of custody, and any courier services that they offer. So I mentioned chain of custody, and this is one thing that a lot of people get tripped up on and don't really understand the importance of it, but this is really a contract, essentially, between the samplers and the laboratory. And you think about the name, the chain of custody. What does custody mean? Well, anyone that had possession of the samples. So the person that actually collected the samples, they're handing that off to somebody else. They need to relinquish that custody on the chain of custody to the other person who's receiving it, and has to maintain that chain of continuous custody all the way from when the samples are collected right through to when they get to the laboratory and are analyzed. Some other essential information that would go on the chain of custody would be your purchase order for the laboratory. Make sure you get your results reported on time. Many labs will hold the results until either they have a purchase order or even have payment for the analyses. The sample IDs, dates, and times that the samples were collected. And that's really important that they sample IDs, dates, and times match the containers, the bottles, and the chain of custody. If there are any discrepancies between those two, it can cause delays and potentially even result in lost or mixed samples that cause a lot of trouble and back work to get sorted out. So it's best to make sure that those are all identical as possible. It also will list the analyses that you're requiring or requesting, and again, to reiterate, signatures of all the way custody. Make sure you're relinquishing and receiving when that change of custody occurs. So some requirements, I guess, and again, some conveniences here as well. The bottle orders from the labs make life a lot easier. The lab can send you everything you need, and it takes a lot of the guesswork out of the situation. You still want to make sure you double check the accuracy of the bottle orders, that everything matches up. But pre-printed chains of custody and labels can take the guesswork out of making sure that those are labeled identically between those two. Any rush requests must be approved in advance by the lab, typically, based on their capacity and availability to handle those analyses that you're requesting on quicker turnaround time. Most labs will give a week or 2 weeks, and sometimes in cases 3 weeks for a standard turnaround time. So you want to ask the laboratory what their standard turnaround time is to make sure you're going to get the results with enough time to turn around and report them and make your observations and notes in your SWIFT when it's due. So you may want to request a rush to have it done in a week or even less if you're really up against the deadline. But again, the planning aspect will help curb some of that pressing need. And also determine how you're going to get the samples to the laboratory. Is that you are going to transport them? Are you going to use the laboratory's courier? Are you going to use a common carrier such as UPS or FedEx? Those are all things to consider and plan for as part of your preparations. So some potential issues to consider with your sampling project. Run-on is stormwater that is entering your facility from another facility. And regardless of where the stormwater originated, the facility that is discharging that stormwater is responsible for it. So if you have run-on to your facility, you're likely going to want to sample it and note it. Make sure you report that and document it in your SWIFT plan. But you may also work with a neighboring facility on stormwater control mechanisms and infrastructure to keep that run-on from entering your facilities. That way you don't have to worry about it sort of cross-contaminating or contaminating your facility from an activity that you're not responsible for. Adverse conditions, or specifically adverse weather conditions, and knowing how you're going to handle severe weather. Definitely want to develop a protocol and train your sampling team to that protocol for things such as thunder and lightning stand-downs, or how you'll handle warnings that are issued by the National Weather Service. As a general good guide, you definitely want to heed the warnings from the National Weather Service and not have anything that's less stringent than anything that may be issued for severe weather. And also just planning for adverse weather conditions. It's a good reason to target storm events that are early in your monitoring period. So if you have to sample twice a year, you know, of course here in the Northeast, that's in the winter and spring, but certainly maybe in the March, April time frame is certainly better than the June time frame as you're running up against the deadline, because you may only get one rain event from the time that you decide you want to start planning your sampling if you do it late in the period. So earlier in the period is much better. And also sampling within 30 minutes of the start of discharge, so getting your samples in time. If your facility has multiple locations to sample from, you may not be able to get to all of them within 30 minutes, so that could be difficult. And again, that's from the start of discharge from those outfalls. It's not from when it begins raining, but from the start of discharge from the facility. So if you have staggered discharges, some discharge before others, you may have a good order to go around your facility and collect those samples and still be able to get them all within 30 minutes of when they begin discharge. Or you may need to add sampling team members to make sure you have enough people to get to all those locations to do the sampling, or space out the sampling across multiple storm events and collect sampling at different outfalls at those different storm events. Now, what storm events qualify for stormwater monitoring? Well, first, they must create a discharge. Any rain or snow melt must create a discharge from your facility. If stormwater isn't flowing off of the site, then the storm event does not qualify. If you have puddles or stormwater flowing on your facility, that does not necessarily qualify if stormwater is not flowing off of your facility. At least 72 hours must have elapsed since the previous measurable storm event, and there is an exception to that. And sort of the reason for the 72 hours is it gives a better picture of a chance for contaminants potentially or for pollutants to build up on the facility and more representative of the discharge when regular activities are going on. So the exception there is if you can document that in your locale that less than 72 hours between storm events is representative for your local storm events during that monitoring period, then you can collect from a storm event that is maybe 24 or 48 hours after the previous event. But again, you need to document that through historical climate trends, locale-specific trends. Now, some safety considerations, obviously, or arguably, this could be the one of the most important things, and we kind of get caught up in all the details of making sure we're doing the sampling properly, but of course protecting ourselves and our staff is just as important or more important to make sure that we are not injuring anyone and putting them at risk, undue risk. So using your company's safety program as a guide, and it varies widely between company to company, but many have, that we deal with, have robust safety programs. So whatever the requirements are, I'd say in your safety system, start with those. But on a basic level, you want to review a sampling SOP, complete a pre-task assessment, so going through all the steps in that standard operating procedure and identifying what the hazards are, ways to mitigate those hazards and protect people. Determine what the appropriate PPE is, and I know we use the term appropriate PPE, and it's up for personal interpretation a lot of times, but we can look into your company-specific protocols for that. Address any site-specific hazards, so if you have slopes or other areas that are hard to get to, especially sometimes in the summer, you've got vegetative growth that are hard to navigate or poisonous plants, other fauna to deal with, then there's certainly something to address as well as part of your planning and safety considerations for people out there. And again, back to the handling adverse conditions, know what you're going to do before you encounter something, but also give those people the authority, people on the sampling team, the authority to stop a sampling event or stop at least a portion of the task if they're feeling that something's unsafe until they address those hazards. Yeah, I've done a lot of preparation and working towards that sampling event. So now you finally know that the weather forecast, something's going to happen. You've planned that with your team. So you're going to want to monitor that weather report fairly closely. Usually in the week leading up to a storm event, we become expert weather forecasters ourselves, watching as many different forecasts as we can, understanding when the rain is going to start, how much it's going to rain on us. So you assemble and check all your gear. So certainly your rain gear, any personal protective equipment that you're going to have, but also sampling containers and coolers, any sampling equipment that you're going to use, if it's a pole sampler, an automatic sampler, any other equipment that you're going to use, and we'll touch on equipment in a few moments here. And also notify and mobilize your monitoring team. So anyone that's involved, you make sure that their schedules are aligned and able to accommodate this rain event, that we're sort of at the mercy of Mother Nature to provide for us. So moving into the next section here about sampling techniques and equipment. Some examples of what you might see for equipment to bring out in the field. Again, we have PPE on here, but there's pH monitoring or meters. You're certainly going to use in the field if that's a required parameter, which in almost every case it is. You may have also other field test kits or other equipment for measuring dissolved oxygen or residual chlorine. Make sure you have all those together, and everyone that is going to use those is trained on those. I'm sure there's other other webinar training programs that we can get into as far as equipment specific. But just know what you're going to use ahead of time, and make sure the people that are going to use those pieces of equipment are trained on them. And your notebooks, make sure you take good notes. It's always important to write down what you see when you see it. You can always transcribe your notes, but as far as the observations go, making sure you get notes while you're actually out there viewing it is important, because even hours or days later, it's usually lost from our memory for the specific details. And that goes especially if you have multiple outfalls that you have to, you're trying to remember, was that outfall 001 or 004 that had the unusual sheen on it. As far as sampling techniques themselves go, so when you're working with your laboratory to determine what the analyses are, and maybe you'll see terms like grab sample and composite sample. A grab sample is more or less a snapshot in time. That's one way to think of it. It's a sample that's collected discretely at a single moment, but technically is defined as a duration of 15 minutes or less. A composite sample would be collected continuously or in small aliquots over a course of the discharge, potentially up to 24 hours. And you can also have composite samples that are made up of grab samples for oil and grease, for example, because the oil and grease can stick to the sides of the container. Those have to be composited in a special way. The laboratory can use a solvent rinse to make sure that they get everything out of the container, so it's, 4 different grab samples can be composited together. But also the automatic sampler will collect small aliquots. Let's say it's in 100 milliliter increments over the course of the discharge, and then that will go into a larger vessel and submit it to the laboratory for analysis as a composite. And we'll make sure the samples are representative. So we've, and we use this term representativeness, whether or not it's actual real English word or not, but that making sure that the samples you collect are representative of the actual stormwater that is flowing from the site. We talked about soil contamination, potentially getting particulates in there that are not representative of your sample, and there's some other contamination concerns that we'll get into here. And making sure you have containers that are appropriate for the analyses, so whether they're plastic or glass, if they're volatile, for volatiles analysis, you may have to use what are called VOAs, VOAs. Those cannot have any head space, meaning no air space inside. You have to have a meniscus. There's a little bit of a technique to getting those samples collected just right. And using any chemical preservatives that, again, this is where the laboratory bottler will come in very handy to make sure that all the bottles are pre-preserved with whatever chemical preservative they may need. And it's with the Ice Ice Baby reference in here, so a little trivia. Just like the stormwater regulations, the song was released in 1990. So for those of you who enjoy that pop culture trivia. But placing samples on ice is a recommended best practice, but it may also be a requirement of the analytical method. So check with the laboratory as far as that being a requirement, but certainly it's always a good practice to refrigerate or put the samples on ice as soon as received, or as soon as collected. I went a little too quick there. So we also want to avoid contamination caused by touching the sample matrix, any airborne contamination potentials, or not changing gloves between sample locations. So this goes to noting any unusual circumstances around your facility. Airborne contamination, if there's fueling going on nearby, there's potential for airborne volatile compounds to get into that sample that you're collecting and can skew your results. It may not actually be in the stormwater, but we're talking about parts per million and parts per billion detection levels. And you don't want to have something show up in there that's not representative of your sample. So you're going to take precautions to avoid contamination all along the way. So along with avoiding contamination, some sample quality assurance processes here. So some terminology that will come up with a laboratory anytime you're dealing with samples. First here is holding times. Now the holding time is defined by the analytical method. So again, another reason to use your partner, your laboratory or a contractor as a resource to help figure out what the holding time is for those particular samples. It can be different for different types of samples, even if you're collecting them at the same outfall. And what the holding time is the length of time that starts with the sample collection before which the analysis must be started. So it can be measured in hours or days, but there's also some cases where the analysis must be performed immediately. So that's an example of pH, total residual chlorine, or dissolved oxygen. As I mentioned, those would have instruments or field test kits that you would bring out to the field to do that as quickly after collection as possible. Certainly within 15 minutes is when you would need to get those done. The sample preservatives that I touched on before also required by the analytical method. Some samples can be preserved at the laboratory, but most must be preserved at the time of collection. So once again, check with the laboratory, refer to the analytical method, and your trusted advisor for assistance on that. Trip blanks, field blanks, and equipment blanks. So first of all, trip blanks, it's a sealed container that is submitted or sent with the sample bottles with you out to the sampling site, and then returned back to the laboratory, but never opened through that whole process. The laboratory will provide that trip blank with purified water as a control, goes with all the samples out to the field and back, and then the lab will analyze that. And if any compounds show up in those trip blanks, then that could be an indication there was contamination along the way. If those same compounds are showing up in the actual samples, those could be a false positive or indicated non-representative sample. A field blank is similar, but it's exposed to the same field conditions as the sample. So you would get a bottle of purified water from the laboratory and a sample container, an empty sample container, and you would fill that sample container with the purified water in the same manner that you would collect your stormwater sample. So making sure you change your gloves, making sure there's other, you're not touching any of the sample matrix or the water, and just to ensure again that there was no issues with the actual field techniques that would introduce any contamination. An equipment blank, again, similar but a little bit more involved or specific for the equipment used. You'd use that purified water and run it through your decontaminated equipment. So you want to decontaminate your equipment before you do the equipment blank or move it to the next sampling location. And the rinsate from that equipment blanks, or pouring that purified water over or through the equipment and then collecting it into a bottle, will show if there's any residual contamination that was not properly decontaminated during that process. And again, to harp on the chains of custody, can never be too careful with chains of custody to make sure that all of the information jives between the sample containers and the chain of custody and all the procedures that go along with that, with signing over custody, relinquishing, and accepting between parties. So again, mentioning your field notes and observations, you definitely want to document any observations in the SWIP, specifically unusual conditions as noted here. But even if they seem insignificant, you still want to mention those because they could become significant once you review the analytical data. Something that seemed insignificant at the time in the field could prove to be a missing link in solving a problem as to why there was certain contaminants showed up at a higher level than you're expecting. When the previous storm event occurred, the rainfall total, if you can estimate or even measure the stormwater flow from your facility, some facilities that manage stormwater flow through some kind of pumping system, you may have a flow meter on there. It's good to write down all those totals. And even having a rain gauge to know how many inches of rain fell in your facility. And depending on the size of your facility, You may need multiple range gauges, or be easier to have gauge at each outfall for accuracy. And also estimating the total stormwater that you sampled. Now, that may be insignificant volume if you're sending 10, 20, 30 liters to a laboratory, but it's still good to document the total volume of the containers that you submitted to the laboratory. So moving on now to managing samples and results. Mention again preservation. So if you have the samples, you've collected them, you want to keep them on ice in a cooler, and making sure you're using the chemically preserved containers, ideally in the field, unless you're able to submit non-preserved samples to the laboratory for them to preserve. You can consult with the laboratory and your advisor on that. Make a copy of the chain of custody. Put the original in a resealable plastic bag to stay dry inside the cooler or wherever the samples are stored. If you're transporting samples to the laboratory, either by courier or yourself, make sure you sign that chain of custody again. I'm going to keep harping on that because that's a big thing. And if you're shipping the samples, some tips include lining the cooler with a plastic trash bag first, and then filling it with ice, and then the sample containers, and then more ice. But also individually wrapping the sample containers, especially glass, with packing and bubble wrap, and then tie the plastic bag before you close the cooler. That will keep any, as the ice melts in transit, especially if you're shipping via like UPS or FedEx, keeps the liquid inside. And also wet ice stickers helps, because if there's a liquid leaking from the bag or from the cooler, the shipping company will have an idea that that's wet ice and not some other unknown clear liquid. And adding tamper evidence seals on the exterior of the cooler also helps. So when the samples arrive at the laboratory, they can visibly see if the container has been opened. And you should store samples only if it's necessary. If you have to do that, it's preferable to do that in an on-site refrigerator. But you can also keep it in the cooler, but make sure it's in a secure, safe location. You want to limit that storage to hours and not days. So if you have to collect samples on Saturday and the laboratory can't receive those samples on Sunday, you might need to keep them until Monday. But you don't want to keep them indefinitely. It's always better to get them to the laboratory, and the laboratory can handle disposal if you decide not to have them analyzed for whatever reason. But definitely better to keep them at the laboratory where they have much better control conditions than potentially at your facility where they could get lost or damaged. So after all that, you finally get the analytical results after you waited for that turnaround time, or at least you know when to expect those samples to come. So set aside time around when you expect to receive the results to review the analytical reports. If you know it's going to be 5 days, check in with the lab, see if everything's still on target, and set aside time so you can review as short a time as possible, certainly within a day of receiving those. Make any notes that you might have, or discuss those with the laboratory. What we do for a lot of our customers is we'll get the analytical results, review those, provide a summary and commentary, interface with the laboratory if there's any questions about quality control data or any integrity of the samples, and then communicate that to our customers. So recommending that you do that as well. If these are your facilities, that you look over the data and review it and talk with people who know about the analytical methods and sample integrity to understand if there's been a problem. Typically, reporting is due within 30 days of the date of sampling. So again, to remind you of the turnaround time, if you have a 15-day turnaround time, you've lost half your reporting period or your reporting deadline. So it's always better to have those results come sooner than later, so you have plenty of time to review, and if there's any issues, that you can discuss those with the laboratory. And I mentioned earlier as well the EPA Net DMR system or similar state-specific system. The systems are very convenient, especially when you're working with a contractor. At Triumvirate, we love these because it's the ease of use in transferring and submitting data. We can manage the data on our end, upload into the system, tell the customer it's ready to be reviewed. It doesn't, we don't have to worry about email. It's all in the secure system that the EPA has online. And our customers really like that arrangement as well. So The only trouble with those systems is they can be a little tricky to set up initially. There's authorizations involved for data providers and making sure you have all the right permissions, and that can take a little time to get off the ground. So don't wait. You get your results, let's say 10 days after your sampling. Don't wait till then to start setting up your NetDMR accounts. You want to do that as soon as you can. But once they're in place, the sampling is usually quite smooth. So we're getting close to the end here. Just wanted to give you a quick summary and questions and answers session here. Just some main points to remind you of. I know we threw a lot at you, so if you have any questions, certainly we're here to help you navigate this process. I know it's a lot to remember, especially if you are relatively new to the sampling game in general, or you're new to a facility and stormwater sampling is part of your responsibilities. But this is one of those programs that comes easier with experience and perspective, so don't be afraid to call us for help if you need it. So understand the requirements, what you're sampling for, knowing what your permit entails, and all those requirements, and your SWIP plan. Plan and prepare, again, we made a focus on that with today's discussion, but you can never, I guess a cliche, never prepare too much, but or too early. But it certainly makes things go a lot easier when you're out there in the field on a rainy day or rainy night, and then you have 30 days to get the results in. You want to make sure things are going smoothly. And maintain sample integrity. Again, you don't have to do it again if you don't have to. So plus there's expense and all that extra effort involved if you have to resample because the samples were not maintained properly. And then review the data and meet your deadlines for reporting and document all your observations in your SWIP, and discuss those with your contractor if you're using one that can help you implement any changes or improvements that you might need. So just quickly before we get to the question, just want to give a little plug here. We have another webinar coming up that I'll be giving at the beginning of January on managing wastewater systems. So kind of a modern approach to improving operations and maintenance. So anyone that has an industrial wastewater system, we encourage you to join us for that in January 7th. And with that, I know, James, you've been kind of manning the controls there. If there's any questions that came through, I can give them a shot.
Sure, thanks, Daryl. And yeah, so at this time we will transition over into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And we'll take a few that have come in already, and I just want to encourage those of you that have a question for Daryl to go ahead and type it into the questions box. We've got about 15 minutes to work with. If something comes to mind after the webinar, no worries, you can reach out. We'll also be following up with you. So there's always an opportunity to continue this discussion later on. Daryl, the first question that came in is from Kelly, and she wants to know, what if only one of two of your outfall sampling points produced a discharge? So if she sent one in for analysis, but the other one never ran.
Yeah, well, I guess, well, as I mentioned, yeah, it has to produce a discharge to qualify for sampling, or I guess it was a qualifying event that I had mentioned. Definitely note that, make notes of that. I don't know in your specific facility if it usually does, or that was that particular rain event. You may need to identify, if that was a 0.2 of an inch rainstorm, maybe you need a 0.4 of an inch rainstorm to produce discharge from that outfall. But just because it didn't produce discharge on that one storm, maybe don't discount it completely. But if it's recurring and it's not discharging on repeated and significant rain events, you may need to make changes to your SWIP to eliminate that one from monitoring requirements.
Right, good advice there. Thanks, Daryl. So moving on, we got a couple more here. So we talked a lot about storing and transportation. So if storing temporarily or sending via FedEx or UPS or whatever method, how do I handle signatures and ensure that those gaps are covered when it comes to custody?
Yeah, that's yeah, we deal with that quite a bit, and there's varying interpretations. The one that we like to use, so whoever is relinquishing basically to an entity, I guess, that can't sign it. So you're packaging them, let's say FedEx or UPS, for example, you're packaging up your samples into a cooler. You're packing the chain of custody securely inside the cooler, and the FedEx driver is probably not going to want to sign that chain of custody anyway. But you are showing chain of custody by your shipping records and the tracking information that goes along with that. So when you relinquish, you would relinquish it to FedEx or UPS or whatever your carrier is, and on the chain of custody, even though they're not necessarily assigning for it on the actual chain of custody. And then when the laboratory receives it, they'll receive it from the shipping company as well. You can show that continuous chain of custody with your tracking documentation. So definitely keep your tracking documentation for any shipments that you make. In the case of a refrigerator, or if you're leaving it in the cooler, I think I mentioned you want to make sure those are in a secure location. Here at our facility at Triumvirate, we have a refrigerator that's inside of our building, which is a key card access building, and then even around that, there's a perimeter fence, security fence with key card access to the gate. So we're able to document that we have, reasonably secure facility for maintaining those samples. Joe public doesn't need to come in and tamper with them. So we sign those from whoever is putting them in the refrigerator to the Triumvirate fridge, and then they can get relinquished from the Triumvirate fridge to our laboratory courier or one of our other employees that's bringing it somewhere. But there are ways to make sure you show that continuity and chain of custody, even if you don't have the actual person to sign for that acceptance. Hope that a lot of words there, but I hope I got the answer across.
Sure, and I think you did. Thanks for clarifying. And what happens? What's the consequence to sort of breaking that chain of custody, or what if a signature is missing? What kind of consequences can you expect?
Yeah, well, the laboratory is probably going to note that. If not directly to you, that may show up as a note in the analytical report. So it's going to be memorialized in their notes. Generally, unless there's a reason to suspect that the integrity of the samples was compromised, there's probably not a lot that's going to come of it. But being a legal document, and think of samples in the case of a crime scene investigation, they're certainly expecting that this is going to be entered into evidence. Maybe we don't have to take it to that extreme, but certainly there is a parallel there with, if this ever did reach a litigation situation, then the integrity of those samples could be called into question, and they may be thrown out as evidence or however they're being considered in that case. So there are ramifications we don't see very often, but certainly environmental matters do end up in litigation. So I guess that would be the ultimate consequence there, a ramification, potentially nullifying all that work that you did to collect samples.
Right, and as a project manager, these are just some things you really want to keep in mind, because ultimately you want to protect the integrity, and you will be responsible for these items. So, Daryl, the next question refers to PPE, and we talked a bit about safety and what appropriate PPE is or is considered for a stormwater sampling project. Can you speak a little bit more to that and give some examples?
Yeah, so I think we had on the slide there, we had somebody in a hard hat with goggles and a dust mask, and then probably is a little bit more than maybe required, but again, I first and foremost would say certainly qualify that appropriate PPE is kind of a cliche in the industry, and really comes down to your company's specific program and really relying on what your guidelines are. But to give, I guess, an example or some basics as far as what I would consider and have experienced for PPE, safety shoes, at least 30 footwear, but definitely recommend steel-toe shoes, rain gear, so you're going to have long-legged pants on, long-sleeve shirt, or again, rain gear that's comparable. Cover your sleeves and cover your legs. Safety glasses and gloves, nitrile gloves, or maybe some work gloves with nitrile gloves over them to prevent cross-contamination, but also your own exposure to the stormwater. But not only the stormwater, but the chemical preservatives. We're talking about nitric acid, sulfuric acid, other compounds that you don't want to come in contact with. So not only are you protecting yourself from potential contaminants in stormwater, which may be very low concentrations still much more acute hazard associated with chemical preservatives.
Great. I think that offers some guidelines, I guess, right? Because appropriate can be kind of vague and, like you said, cliche. So we just want to dig in a little deeper for this specific situation.
Yeah, and that's very specific to your, what your site-specific considerations. I mean, if you have to rappel down a cliff, your PPE is going to be different than if you're just standing, on a sidewalk in the middle of the country somewhere.
Exactly. So I think that leads well into these next couple of questions, which talk more about location. And Robert wants to know, what if the discharge is not regular, and when it does occur, it doesn't reach a stream? What do you do then?
Again, this pretty site-specific question, so without knowing, maybe we can talk about that one some more if we can get in touch with Robert. But if it's so you need to collect it at the perimeter of the property line, essentially, where it's leaving the facility. So if that stream is on your property, that may be a little more tricky. But if it's still leaving your property but not making it to a stream, that still would be considered if there's flow during that storm event. That would be a qualifying event that you would monitor or sample.
All right, good. And since it is so specific, like you said, we can get a hold of Robert and see if we can get some more details and kind of steer him in the right direction. The next question, we'll take a couple more here. I think we'll start to wrap things up in a few minutes. This is from Dave. He says that we recently had our parking lot paved. There was some residual odor of asphalt, petroleum odor-like. Should we simply document this, or is there something we should do about it?
Yes, I guess is the answer. Certainly document it. Definitely want to make note of that. You're likely to see you may not see a spike in the analyses if you can wait within the period. Certainly, I talked about doing it as early in the period, the monitoring period, as possible. If you don't have a pressing need to do it, let's say in January, and you just paved, or depending on where you are, you probably wouldn't pave in January, but if you can wait until later in the year after it's had sort of seasoning and some chance to reduce that, go up in your sampling. I would recommend doing that. If you can't because you have a deadline coming, that's where that documentation.
And you're breaking up a little bit there, Daryl. I'll ask you the next question. I think we'll take probably 2 more at this point, and we'll close up here. Hopefully the audio improves on your end. But so this question, we're talking about labs and locating a lab. If you don't have one or don't work with one on a regular basis, where would you recommend looking? Sort of how do you start that process?
Yeah, DLAP certification. There's some good resources online through DLAP, and we can probably provide, if anybody had a specific, I couldn't find themselves, we can get you the link for that. There's a search tool on that website where you can search by a multiple different criteria. One good one being by the state. That's the state that the laboratory is located in. Again, that search tool is great for identifying the NELAB approved laboratories. I would just say that just because it's a NELAB approved laboratory doesn't mean it does every analysis that you need to do. So you may need to talk to a few different laboratories. And that's something we can help our customers with because we know which labs, in some cases, are doing certain analyses and not others, and can help with guidance on selecting a laboratory or even our own experience as far as the quality of their results and their process. But that reference for NELAP, we can help get some people some links if they can't find that through their own searching.
Sure, and we can even include that in our follow-up. So final question here, going back to our poll question at the beginning of the webinar, we asked how often are you reviewing your plan, and most, or about 60%, are reviewing it annually, which is what we recommend at a minimum. So can you briefly talk to what the benefits may be to doing those reviews more frequently? Is it necessary?
Anytime there's a changing site condition, so involving a SWIP team member in construction projects or anything like that that's changing your any exposure to stormwater would be a good time to review that. At least from a cursory perspective, someone that's knowledgeable about the SWIP in general is good to have in some of those meetings for production or projects planning and implementation and throughout those projects. But if your site is pretty much static and hasn't changed, then just dusting it off, making sure if it's been turnover on your sampling team or the SWIP team, updating it then. Certainly once a year would still be the recommendation, just so you're able to identify any of those minor changes that are not necessarily as apparent as a big construction project.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Daryl. Really appreciate the responses to the questions and the informative presentation. Really tried to cover the life cycle of this project and emphasized a bit more on the planning and preparation, but there's a lot to it. And as Daryl mentioned, feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be following up within the next day. You will receive the slides, recording, a short survey, which we would appreciate your feedback on. Let us know what you thought, how we can improve. And we hope to see you at the webinar that Daryl is presenting on in early January on the 7th, and we'll include a link for you to register for that one as well if you're interested. And finally, a special offer to help you get started on your next stormwater sampling project. So that'll wrap it up. That'll do it for us today. Daryl, do you have anything else to add before we close down?
No, I don't. I'm just anxious to hear what people are seeing for questions out there. I think we have good questions that came through, so I think there's a lot more to share.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Appreciate your participation, and have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next time. Bye.